Thank you, Connie. Thanks for doing the announcements for the chapter. So Drew Foster, our speaker tonight, is a master's student in the Remote Sensing and the Geospatial Analysis Lab at the University of Washington School of Environmental and Forest Sciences. Drew has a background in botany and ecology and is a trained arborist. He volunteers monitoring rare plants for the UW Botanic Gardens Rare Care Program. And one of his favorite botanical pastimes is hunting for belly plants in the Mojave. I asked Drew what his favorite Washington native plants were, and unsurprisingly, Showy Stickseed is his favorite forb. And his favorite tree is Western red cedar. So folks, if you have any questions tonight for Drew, we're going to take those at the end of the presentation. So feel free to go ahead and put your thoughts and questions into either the chat box at the bottom of your screen or the Q&A. And then we will make some time at the end of the presentation for Drew to answer your questions. All right, Drew, we're ready.
Okay. Is that the screen share still working out? You see that okay?
Yep, that looks good.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for that introduction and inviting me to speak to you all this evening. Really excited to share my research and what I've been doing the last couple years. I think this has been a really interesting project, and hopefully you will all learn something new or have some questions at the end that we can talk about. Yeah, so my project's focused on the conservation of showy stickseed, Hackelia venusta, and using drones to kind of see if that's a tool that can further plant conservation. And so my work is supported through the McIntyre-Stennis Cooperative Forestry Program, which is through the USDA National Institute of Food and Agriculture. And as Emily mentioned, I'm in the Remote Sensing Geospatial Analysis Lab, and my advisors are Monica Moskal and Wendy Gibble through the UW Botanic Gardens Rare Care Program. So I want to start off just with a background and kind of a deep dive into the plant. This is kind of a focal species as part of the research in kind of general to see if drones are useful for different aspects of plant conservation. And I figured this group would be most interested in the nitty-gritty of the plant, so this is exciting. It's in the borage family, so probably many of you are familiar with other species in the genus. Showy stickseed is actually Washington's most rare plant. It is state and federally endangered. The habit is a short perennial. It's 2 to 4 decimeters tall. The leaves are 2 to 5 centimeters long by 3 to 7 millimeters wide, so lanceolate, narrowly elliptic, or narrowly oblong. The inflorescence, the pedicels are quite long, but what really makes this particular species stand out in the genus are the large white flowers, 13 to 22 millimeters wide. So it's definitely the largest white flowered Hackelia we have, and it earns its name, certainly. The other species that is closely related to it, very similar in appearance, is Hackelia taylori, which is blue flowered and higher elevations. but there's been some genetic work done indicating that they're very similar. And so there's a hypothesis around potential speciation, but that hasn't been pursued in depth, so I can't speak to it exactly. So here's a nice close-up picture of the flower, the yellow throat. And this is a nice picture showing it in its habitat, kind of on these rocky outcroppings, very minimal soil depth, very sandy, sandy to gravelly, loose. You can see the leaves are really hairy. It's a little sticky right next to this penstemon. And here's where it really earns its name, and flowers in May, and really is quite showy. It's very impressive. So it occurs in Chelan County in open ponderosa pine forests, commonly with Ceanothus velutinus, spirea, in the Eastern Cascades. I'm sure most of you are very familiar with this. Kind of that open pine, Doug fir, big leaf maple here and there. Really in the dry, loose granitic sand and crevices and big granite boulders. It occurs at elevation ranges of 450 to about 2,000 meters, really on these fragile, steep slopes, 25 to 70 degrees, which is really most of the slopes in the Eastern Cascades. And it does grow alongside a lot of other commonly occurring herbaceous forbs, so like yarrow and Cerastium, Colomia grandiflora, folius, penstemon, prunosis. So here's a good picture showing Cerastium down at the bottom and penstemon and Showy Stickseed, kind of all growing happily together, cohabitating in the same space. And so here's a good picture of the kind of zooming out toward the habitat, and so you can really see some of these big granite boulders and ferns sticking out, and it really does grow in a lot of these cracks and crevices, and where the soil has built up over time. Oops. And you can see this is one of the drones we were flying up here. And this is a photo by Ben Legler, which I think does a really good job showing kind of this very sparse soil, big boulders, not necessarily talus slopes, but kind of these boulder fields with sand in between and plants miraculously growing out between them. This is a very typical habitat.
Hey,
So
Drew.
it is.
Sorry, this is Emily, just gonna request, so you're freezing up a little bit occasionally, and sometimes it helps if it's possible for you to turn your video off, and then sometimes the presentation moves forward at a little more abrupt pace.
Okay.
All right, thank you. No, you're doing great, thank you.
Yeah. I don't think I said anything that was wildly elucidating. So,
okay, perfect.
You know, hopefully the pictures came through well. So, continuing on more about Showy Stickseed, it is both rare and endangered. So plants can be rare, but not necessarily endangered. So there's it really is restricted to one known declining population of several hundred individuals. And as land managers noticed that this plant was declining in numbers, they were searching for other populations with little success, and were able to get it federally listed in 2002. So the recovery team includes the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which is in charge of the Endangered Species Act, the U.S. Forest Service, where Hackelia venusta primarily occurs, the Washington Department of Natural Resources Natural Heritage Program, and the UW Botanic Gardens Rear Care and Plant Conservation Program. And so in 2007, a recovery plan was established to get a baseline assessment of where these plants are, their habitat requirements, and set up some recovery actions to recover the population and delist it, right? That's the goal with any endangered species, really, is to get it delisted. But first we need to grow the population and stabilize it. So some of the conservation actions taken to date are the characterization of habitat requirements, as well as soil and vegetation conditions, the development of propagation and outplanting protocols. So this has been grown in greenhouse conditions, and it's an incredibly meticulous and difficult procedure to excise the seed from seed coat, from what I understand and hear. So it's a lot of work has gone into being able to propagate this and then bring those individuals out for outplanting sites to bolster and grow the population. So my project really engages in monitoring the populations, and as well as identifying potential sites for future outplanting. So new areas that might be suitable. So that's kind of how my project came to be. And so here's a photo my partner Sarah took. She was actually responsible for growing several hundred of these cute little Hackelia. And here's one. They're each one is tagged so they can go back and monitor and see how the outplanting populations are performing. If there's any improvement, they're not quite old enough to be having any substantial improvement, but some of them are surviving, not in huge numbers, but some outplantings have been better than others. So that leads into my project and how that came about. And this is one of the drones that we used. It's this is one of the smaller ones, and these arms, which the rotors are on, actually fold into it, and you can put this in a backpack and hike it uphill and launch it if need be. So this is a smaller, lightweight one. So as I explained, Hackelia grows on this really steep, fragile habitat, and in the recovery plan for the species, they listed research and monitoring as a negative impact. So just boots on the ground, walking up and down these hill can negatively impact the seed bank. It's really just very steep, decomposing granite, very fragile habitat. So the idea was, can we use drones to alleviate that impact and be able to kind of remotely monitor these plant populations? And so that's, at the time, I was working at the Arboretum for the UW Botanic Gardens, and also a volunteer with the Rare Care Monitoring Program, going out to monitor rare plants. And so I was looking to go back into grad school and study remote sensing, which is looking at satellite data and aerial imagery, specifically around ecology, plant ecology, conservation, and the environment. So this was a cool project, kind of find a couple of my interests. And so thinking about the drone as a tool to be able to monitor plant populations, but also use it to uh, identify some suitable habitat for those outplantings I mentioned. So this first research question I mentioned, I'll go through this kind of quickly. Can drones be used to monitor plants and plant populations? So in order to answer that question, I started looking at spectral reflectance data, and this is a spectrometer which measures the reflectance. So the sunlight shines onto the earth, and uh, various objects absorb some of that and reflect it at different wavelengths. So we went out and did some testing to see if Hackelia had sort of a different reflectance signature than other objects. So you can see the rock reflects really high, and these are the visible bands. We have blue, green, red, and these are near infrared areas of the electromagnetic spectrum. And that really stands out differently than some of these other objects like ceanothus, evergreen shrub. But it is, the soil is pretty flat. It's kind of an even reflectance. Uh, but I'm not going to get too deep into this because this part of my project didn't work out as I was hoping because we weren't able to fly the drone low enough to really identify individual plants to be able to pick out some of these reflectance signatures. So I pivoted and have expanded more on the question of how can drone imagery be used to improve habitat suitability predictions. So we use statistical models, they're called species distribution models, to be able to predict potential habitat. And this can be done with any known model inputs. So that might be satellite imagery or LiDAR from a plane or ground survey data, temperature, uh, things like that, wind speed even. The advantage with drones is they really provide a higher spatial resolution. So just that fine scale resolution in the imagery, as well as temporal discretion. You can choose when to fly the drone a lot easier than you can when to fly a plane, for instance, or when a satellite happens to pass over. And there's repeatability with drones. So you can fly a mission and repeat that exact same mission every year if you wanted to. So I was thinking about this project in identifying, again, the bigger goal was to identify some potential habitat. Where can we plant these little baby Hackelia that have had so much care and time into growing in the greenhouse and making sure they have a good spot to thrive. So the first question was, where are we going to fly the drone? We have kind of a large area where we think that there could be suitable habitat outside of where the core population currently exists. So the first step was to use coarse resolution satellite data and some other terrain data like slope and aspect, as well as land cover class like tree cover, shrub cover, things like that, and put that into a classification algorithm to identify kind of a really coarse scale look at some areas to fly the drones to be able to get to kind of narrow that search window. And so this is a really messy map to look at. The green areas were the result of this satellite classification exercise. Okay, now I have some target areas that would be good to target to fly the drone. So last summer, despite a lot of technical difficulties and working through a global pandemic, we were still able to fly about 360 acres at 90 meters above ground level. So in the map here, you can see these purple areas, and that was those green areas on that map before. So this is the purple areas are the result of that satellite classification. And so I thought, okay, this would be great if we could fly the drone in here and then get some really fine scale resolution to be able to really see what's going on here. But then after our first flight, I realized pretty limited as far as line of sight, which you need to be able to see the drone at all times, and battery life. So the blue areas are the extent which we could actually fly. So this is about a quarter mile from our launch area. And then the green areas are where we were actually able to fly and the areas we were able to cover. So overall, I think I felt, I wish we could have gotten more imagery and more imagery at lower elevations. But there's a lot of challenges associated with that because there's really steep canyons and tall trees, and it was hard to operate during the pandemic. So I was happy with what we got. We got some really cool images, and this is kind of the resulting product of what we get. So this is an ortho image, which is just a corrected image for slope. So it's kind of a lot of pictures. The drone flew back and forth all over this area, took a bunch of pictures, and then we stitched them all together, which kind of resolves this into an image that we can use for further analysis. Not these really long shadows. We try to reduce the shadows as much as possible, but that can be really difficult, especially up in the northern latitudes. In a very steep canyon, there's always shadows. So but even in the shadows, we can still pick out objects like this fallen log and rocks and things like that. So that's helpful to kind of identify this finer scale. So some of the initial results, we were able to pull out about 33 acres in 7 different areas for future on-the-ground surveys. So, like I said, we narrowed that search window. So we were able to kind of take this huge area, several thousand acres, and pull out a couple dozen acres to really prioritize where we're going to go search for those next outplanting sites. So I'm really happy about that. And with that imagery, we're able to do some really fine scale land cover classification, which is basically classifying the things in the image that we see into things like soil, shrub, evergreen tree, deciduous tree. So that can be really helpful too. One of the threats to the Hackelia population is ceanothus encroachment, actually just shading it out and outcompeting. It grows at a faster rate and isn't burning from wildfires. So this is a pretty good way to get an idea of shrub encroachment over time. So some of what I'm working through as I wrap up on my project are working through some of the statistics of does the drone imagery improve predictive models in a statistically significant way over that satellite data. It's certainly very useful for land managers and improved monitoring. So now I'm just kind of trying to figure out how to show that statistically, which is what the science is all about. So just to kind of go over I mentioned a lot of these limitations, just limited where we can take off and land. The drone has to be in visual line of sight. You know, any wind above 10, 15 miles an hour makes it really challenging to fly the drone. The rain is not great. Battery life, we can fly for about 10 to 15 minutes per flight. So we had 7 batteries that we just kept charging and swapping out during our 4-hour or so window of flight time. The GPS signal in these really steep canyons, it makes it really hard. It can throw off the drone navigation. This is a multispectral camera, which takes images in the near infrared. And so that increased payload reduces your flight time. There's also kind of a negative connotation around drones. And so I'm hoping work like this helps to showcase some of the positive things that they can do. I think they're going to be a lot more adopted in inland management. I know drones, initially most of the development R&D is through the military to spy on people and harm people around the world. So it's an unfortunate way to develop technology, but there's a lot of really great uses for drones or unmanned aerial systems as sort of a common term thrown out quite a bit. In conservation, used a lot in agriculture and a lot of applications in forestry as well, because they're cheaper than a plane to fly. And they're able to get a lot of that same targeted resolution that I mentioned before. So, and there's also varying regulations. So it took a while for the FAA to even develop really robust drone regulations. And we're still working through what that means for land managers today. And there's some challenges around where you can fly because you are operating an aircraft in federal airspace. And so you have to follow all those rules and regulations and have your pilot certificate to be able to fly. So, and it varies around the world too. So each country has a different set of regulations. So, I think it's changing over time, and so here's a few more examples of kind of some of the benefits of the drones. Again, I mentioned one of the biggest ones and obvious ones is improved resolution. So we can see a satellite image here. You can start to make out, okay, this is a pine tree, probably knowing the location. This was taken sometime in the fall as leaves were starting to change color. You can make out, where there's ground, but it's pretty hard to really get an idea of what things are. This is imagery from a plane, which is starting to get a little bit better. We can start to pick out things like a log and some rocks a little bit better. And then the drone imagery is really quite clearly a huge improvement. So now we can take this, back to the office, lab, and really be able to say, do some species identification for these larger species. This was too high elevation to be able to pick out things like Hackelia or some other smaller forbs, but we can pick out these clumps of ceanothus very clearly and discreetly, as well as these rocks and logs. And we can do this flight several times a year, every year, every other year, and see how this changes over time without actually, putting the boots on the ground, which is really helpful. So I talked earlier about kind of stitching together. The drone kind of flies back and forth, taking hundreds to thousands of of photos, and then we stitch those all together to create an ortho mosaic. So this is a raw image that the drone took, and so if you look from right to left, you can kind of see one side of a tree or another side of a tree, and it looks a little warped. So when we stitch it all together, we flatten out that image so we can get this kind of top-down slope corrected view. And it really helps with our analysis because now we have an image that we can process quite easily in a whole bunch of different software. But it also can produce some funky artifacts like this at the bottom was probably a gust of wind or where the drone didn't get complete coverage. So we do have some kind of funky errors that you might not see from really professional quality things like satellite imagery, but still really great to be able to do this at a relatively cheap cost. So just to kind of, I've said a lot of this already, but just to kind of recap some of the benefits of the drone imagery, it's highly repeatable. There's some initial investment costs. But once you have the equipment, it's not a terrible investment to keep things up as long as you don't crash the drone too much. You really have, again, where it really shines is that improved temporal and spatial resolution. You're really looking at centimeter level resolution versus several feet. And you can acquire it more or less any time as long as the weather's cooperating and you're able to get out there to the site. You're able to do really excellent targeted monitoring of land cover change, and it's relatively cheap when you're comparing it to planes, an acquisition from an airplane. And it's used right now a lot in forest health. So the Washington DNR actually is using drones to fly over forest stands to do some forest inventory analysis. It's being used a lot for structure and microtopography, where there's gaps in LiDAR, which I won't talk too much about, but that's basically three-dimensional structural data, which you can mount on a drone, but they're very expensive and very heavy. So technology's got to come a little ways before that's more widely adopted. Also used for invasive plant monitoring, especially larger invasive plants. My colleagues in our lab did a project on reed canary grass. There's a lot of uses in conservation and in forestry and agriculture. And I just kind of wanted to sort of end and wrap up my talk a little bit, thinking about the implications for plant conservation. So how does this relate to native plant conservation? I think, especially for this group, I didn't want to get into a lot of the technical details, but really, acknowledging that nothing replaces the knowledge and human relationships that we have with plants and the environment. And as we're thinking about conserving species, I think we really need to find some sustainable solutions in our world to prevent species and biodiversity loss in the first place. But as we're working on some of those cultural changes, I think there's tools and technologies which are really helpful to land managers, but also to people working in conservation. One reason I was really excited about this project was drones, like I said, are used a lot in forestry and agriculture, but there's not a whole lot in the world of plant conservation. So this was an exciting opportunity for me to kind of see if this was a tool that would be useful, and kind of see where that is. I was listening to a podcast a while back. I think it was In Defense of Plants, if anybody listens to that. And there was somebody out in Hawaii using drones, and they're actually finding plants that they thought were extinct on the islands. And that's a tool for them where they can't physically get to a lot of places. So they're launching them off of boats and off of cliffs to monitor rare plants out in Hawaii. And there's some work that's been done in Arizona and Utah, looking at plant conservation using drones. So I think there is a lot of future applications for identifying specific plants and kind of looking at plant demographics. So how do populations change over time without impacting the habitat, especially if it's really steep and fragile and difficult to get to. You know, a question I get quite a bit from this is, well, this technology, these drones are going to replace people. This is a terrible thing. Like, we need to bring more people out to do this conservation work and biology work. And I 100% agree with that. Unfortunately, budgets in the land management agencies have been cut for decades. And, I think this is a potential tool for really improving some efficiency and broadening search results, and really just helping understaffed agencies, but also conservation focused consulting companies as well. I think there's a lot of really interesting opportunities here. And so I think, while I wasn't able to actually identify individual plants of Hackelia, I was able to identify quite a bit of habitat throughout kind of the Tumwater and Icicle Creeks areas, which was a really great place to spend some summer days. So, and to kind of wrap up, rethinking plant conservation is a little bit, I really have spent the last few months really thinking more deeply about, plants as a teacher. They've existed on this land longer than us, and what can we learn from plants, and what are they telling us? And thinking about what can we do, what can we give back to plants in the land? And I think, this group and Native Plant Society, preaching to the choir, it's definitely, I think you all understand that. So I'm glad to be giving this presentation to a group of like-minded folks. But I think that's where we need to start kind of shifting our thinking, rather than being so worried about species loss, kind of shifting the thinking toward more of a proactive approach. What can we learn? What are they telling us? What can we do for them? And so, I really just wanted to highlight the Native Plant Society's mission to promote the appreciation and conservation of Washington's native plant through study, education, and advocacy. I think that this is a project that really falls in line with that. And, I hope that there's more opportunities for this kind of research to happen throughout Washington State, but also around the world. And then I also wanted to give a plug for the Rare Care program, which I'm sure many in the audience are active volunteers. But it's a great program that builds partnerships with federal, state, and local agencies to provide critical information needed in conservation and recovery of the state's native rare species. And it uses citizen science and students to participate in rare plant monitoring, ex situ conservation, reintroduction and education opportunities. And so if you all are interested, they host a training every February, I believe, to become a new monitor, or you can go out with a friend who's going out this spring or summer. It's a really great way to botanize with a purpose, because that is going back to the Washington Natural Heritage Program to really start to work toward citizen science and conservation of our precious native plants. So with that, thank you again, and I'll open it up for some questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Drew. If you wouldn't mind maybe turning your camera back on, and you can probably stop with the screen share if you want, or we can leave up this lovely Hackelia picture. But there you are. Hi. We did get some really great questions from everybody in the audience. Thank you all so much. And just a quick reminder for folks, if you want to ask some questions, you can either use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen or the chat box. And we are going to take probably 15 minutes or so to get through some of these great questions for Drew. So far, Drew, your questions seem to be falling into two categories. One of them is technology questions, and the other is like not technology questions. So which ones would you like to take first?
No preference. Whatever you.
No preference.
Whatever
All
you
right.
got.
Let's start kind of where we started with your presentation then. So a couple questions about the species.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit more about why Showy Stickseed is such a rare plant? And specifically, can you tell us more about some of the threats that face the species?
Yeah, so I'm definitely not an expert by any means. I'll just preface with saying that, my research is really focused more on the remote sensing side of things and looking at habitat. So I really relied heavily on the work and reports of others. There's been a lot of research done over the last 2-3 decades or so, some of which is available online. But yeah, it's a good question, and I don't think there's a super straightforward answer. A lot of rare plants are rare because of geographic location, right? They're limited to a mountain peak or some unique spot where it's really been able to develop and evolve into a unique niche, or maybe over time. This is where the evolutionary biologists come in and do a lot of the DNA work to kind of see what's happening. Species can be really abundant, and then as climates change, be restricted to a smaller area. So as far as this species is concerned, earlier I mentioned Hackelia taylori, and so there are some thoughts that it is potentially closely related, and this is just a variant of that, but there's not been the in-depth DNA work, as I understand, to kind of really tease that out. All I know is that they're really similar genetically and in form as well, but they occur in very different places and different elevations. So maybe this is one plant or the other moving up or down in elevation, and a variant in flower color for whatever reason. There are some threats from construction highway development and erosion. Again, it's a really steep, sandy slope. Some fires have gone through, but I think the fires are probably good for the population because it needs to grow in more. It does face threats from ceanothus and closed canopy cover. So I think fire regime changes are probably negatively impacting this, but I don't think this was a super abundant species to begin with. So
Okay.
That's kind of what I got. But
Okay. Thank you. Let's see. Earlier in your presentation, you talked a little bit about the sort of outplanting portion of your talk, and we had some questions about the survivorship of your outplantings.
Yeah, so again, this is Wendy Gibble. If any of you are familiar with her, she's associate director of the UW Botanic Gardens and leads the rare air program. So this is really she would have a lot of those answers. I could ask Sarah, what do you think survivor numbers are like?
No cover.
Yeah.
A lot of it depends on how lucky we are with snow.
20%.
It declines over a number of years.
Yeah.
We start out, I think our 2018 planting started out about 60%. And it's kind of expected to decline. But, yeah.
So for those that can't hear that, so over the few outplantings that have occurred, they started out pretty strong, about 60% survival. And there was a year where there was really good snowpack afterward, and that's really helped. But attrition increases over the years. So I think it's not recruiting that well. So the outplantings have not been as successful as they've hoped.
Okay. As is often the case with rare plants, it seems like. Let's see, there's lots of technology questions. I'll just do those all at once. So Barbara's wondering if you had any interactions with animals while you were doing your drone research. And I think she might be wondering, maybe impacts of drones on birds, or if you had any issues with that.
Yeah, so we had a couple instances where birds are interested in the drones. For the most part, we were flying pretty high, like above tree line, so we weren't, and we were outside of most nesting periods. We coordinated with the Forest Service, so to make sure we weren't in any critical zones where there was known nesting raptors or anything like that. But we did notice on a couple occasions where birds flying around would be interested and get kind of close, which is terrifying because you don't want to hurt the bird, obviously, but you also don't want your drone to fall out of the sky. So there's always at least two of us. So one person piloting the drone and the other person just kind of watching it. So you always have a couple sets of eyes and just kind of ready to deal with anything unexpected. But once it gets more than 50 or so feet away, you can't really hear it. So the noise impact is really low. I'm sure everyone's had an experience where you're relaxing at a campground or out on a hike and you just hear that whir of a drone. Somebody's flying it down a canyon and it's really annoying. But once it's far enough away, and the decibels are super low, so I don't think there's really any big impacts on nesting birds, but haven't seen any birds like actually try and attack it or anything, which is good.
Okay. That is good, thanks. I feel like that's probably a good segue into some of, we had a couple of questions about slope and terrain. I mean, you showed us some pictures about the, showing the kind of challenging terrain in which the species exists. Ron is wondering if the steep slope was the primary reason that you were unable to fly the drone closer to the ground. And I think he might be talking about one of your earlier slides when you talked about how it ended up not being possible to really discern the difference in between some like specific species.
Yeah, so yes, we had some challenge, like I mentioned earlier, we had some challenges in addition to COVID challenges. We also had some technology issues. It was quite a while before we kind of honed in our system. So we were trying to use software to plan the flight so the drone would actually follow the terrain. So if you think about flying a steep slope, we want to stay the same height above ground level at any given time. Because if you're flying at one level altitude and the ground below changes, your imagery is going to be really different resolutions. So depending on how far away you are from the ground. And that makes it hard to create those Ortho Mosaics. So we're trying to get this software to work and it just wasn't working. So that was one of the reasons why we're trying to fly really high. The other thing is when you're tracking the terrain, you're not necessarily tracking where the trees are. So if you're trying to fly below tree line, that adds another challenge. So because if the drone, grazes a leaf on a tree and hits one of those rotors, it'll just drop to the ground, which is actually did happen to us on one of our first flights where the terrain following was not working. So we're flying at level altitude over a relatively flat area. But we weren't flying high enough and it flipped the side of a willow, I think it was. And we spent a whole next day hiking to find this thing in a bush.
Oh no.
So it's really helpful to have everything working really well. So eventually we did get everything to work really well, but by that point it was pretty late in the summer and into getting close into the fall, and Hackelia is no longer flowering, so there was really no point to be able to fly low. So we were just kind of again focusing on that habitat. So ideally, you could map out where your trees are and have the drone fly in between the trees, or you can just manually fly the drone in between the trees. It gets really hard to see. So when it goes behind a tree or behind a rock, you can't see it anymore. You can't fly it unless it's automated. So that's sort of a long-winded answer. Hopefully that answers the question more or less.
Yeah, I think so. It's interesting. Maybe like a month or two ago, I sat in on another webinar of a different master's student who was using drones and researching rare plants, and this project was in the desert in Utah where there's no trees and it was perfectly flat, and it was the plant in question was a very, very showy, huge yellow flowered perennial. And
Yeah.
I can only imagine the issues that you faced even with just terrain. in this project. So it's really impressive.
Yeah, so this was a good project to identify basically any limitation you could think of. We had it, like, for example, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but there was a lot of plants that would be growing out of like the base of these boulders, which are always in shadow. And, you know, you would miss them sometimes standing right over them. So it's probably one of the more challenging projects as far as identifying individual plants. So thus,
Yeah.
the natural shift toward
Right.
Yeah.
Lori's wondering if you ever tagged the drone and then used GPS to find them when they drop from the sky, or if that's a common thing.
Yeah, so they do have a GPS. There's actually two. We flew two different drones. This was a small Mavic, both the brand DJI. And this one was the one I said you could fold up these arms and put it into a backpack, so super small, lightweight. And this one's an Inspire, and it's a bit heavier and bulkier, but it can handle the payload of this larger camera. But this is a GPS sensor up here.
Okay.
And there's another GPS in the drone which communicates with the remote controller. And so, which is also connected to a laptop that we were running. So until it crashes, it's recording where it is. And so you have a record of where it was up until it no longer is transmitting a signal.
Okay. That leads us nicely into some of our other questions. So one of our attendees was just asking that, which drone did you use? And then he says, it looks like you had an Inspire 1 on the slide. And then he says, also consider using machine learning to process detection of the flowers.
Yep, that's like, I didn't want to get too in the weeds for this talk,
Yes.
so I didn't go into a lot of that. Tried to keep it kind of high level and about flowers. So, yep, this is an older Inspire, the first generation Inspire 1. So like I said, you know, it's an expensive and, you know, initial investment, but as long as you keep it up, it still does its job just fine. As long as the company continues to make batteries for it. And then these are 3D printed parts that you can mount, that we mounted the multispectral sensor, which takes the infrared and the near infrared. There's like fancier things you can buy that really make this look a lot cleaner rather than our like zip ties and Velcro straps.
Right.
But it worked out really, I mean, the 3D printed acrylic or whatever it is pretty lightweight. So it's a good way to go versus some of the GoPro mounts are more heavy duty. One issue we did run into though was there is a government ban on Chinese telecommunications devices, which led to a ban starting in the Department of Defense, which then the Department of Interior adopted, which includes DJI drones, which is one of the most common drone manufacturers. And the grant I was working under falls under that category of Department of Interior. So again, that kind of is that limitation of regulations. It's something we weren't even aware of when we started, and then realized, like, oh, well, this is, there's a lot of limitations that seem kind of silly. But.
All right, a couple more tech questions while we're at it. Did you use a Micasense red edge camera? And then also, which software did you use to process your imagery?
Yep. So this is the Red Edge camera. This is an older model. They make newer models. Micasense is a company out of Seattle. There's other sensors. They now have a system that collects 10 total bands. So there's two of these cameras kind of next to each other. So you have a trade-off because now you're carrying more payload, but you're getting those extra bands of that I was showing earlier in that reflectance signature, which can be really helpful for calculating vegetation indices as well as thinking about trying to identify species if you were able to do that. The software we used was I used Agisoft Metashape to stitch all the photos together, and then other than that, just using GIS and some R to do the statistical modeling.
Okay, awesome. Just a couple more questions if you got time and if folks want to stick around. Chris is wondering, Drew, if you could speculate on the scalability of your results within the range of the species.
So within the range of this species, I mean, I think we were pretty maxed out as far as how far we're willing to go, because you got to think about the context of a native rare plant. It really occurs in this one spot and there's no known populations outside of this. So, we went as far as we probably possibly could to identify locations, distant from the core extant population. Could have gone a little bit higher elevation, but we were limited by the battery life and line of sight. We just couldn't get up higher elevation, which is fine because we did identify some site way up high. You'd have to hike a bunch of plants up there, and it'd be super feasible for outplanting efforts. Scalability for other plant species, not Hackelia venusta, it's really you're just limited by some of these other things, like where you can take off and land and your visual line of sight. Improved battery life, improved technology, you can really take it anywhere.
All right, awesome. Let's see, one more question. Actually, this is my question. I was curious, what sort of permitting you had to go through. You mentioned that this is federal land and airspace over federal lands. What kind of permitting did you have with the Forest Service to be able to use drones?
Yeah, so none, actually. The Forest Service doesn't require a permit, but as I mentioned, this project is part of, like, under the umbrella of the larger recovery team of which the Forest Service is part. So we were contacting folks at the Forest Service, again, to make sure we're not affecting nesting bird populations, things like that. And then there's no permit that we had to fill out, but we did have to notify them. So they knew the dates and locations where we were, just so their law enforcement officers and other wildlife biologists and their team knew what we were doing and what was going on. As far as the airspace regulations, all of that is, if you're operating a drone commercially, as we were, you're required to have a pilot certificate through the FAA, and through that training, you can find out what you can do in what airspace. There's some, like, you can't fly next to SeaTac, for example, right, where there's planes coming in and out. So it's a lot more. Oh, and there's also military flight lines as well where you're not allowed to fly. But that all comes through the FAA training.
Okay. Let's see. We got a question from Yanka, who wants to know if you're planning to, if there are future plans for your project, are you planning to fly during flowering season at all this year?
Yeah, so we sort of didn't get the greatest imagery last year during flowering season for the reasons I mentioned with the terrain software and some other technical issues. And then this year we have issues with the ban on Chinese parts. So cannot use a DJI to do that. So I'm going to be spending my time focusing on finishing writing my thesis and unfortunately not doing low elevation flights over the flowering plants, which is unfortunate because I think it'd be really interesting, but doesn't mean somebody else can't do it.
Good point. Good point. I wanted to share with you, Drew, just, well, wait, we might have one more question. Let's see. Nope, not a question. Just a comment from Ron Bockelman, who says that, so he works with Pediacactus nigerspinus, which is another rare plant in Washington. And he says that drones are being tested out at Wild Horse Wind Farm for study of that species occurrence and abundance. And he says he'd love to be in touch with you to get some feedback about that work.
Oh yeah.
So Ron, if you're there, you can contact Drew at his UW email address if you want to maybe talk about
I'll
that.
put that in the chat.
That'd be great. Thank you. And I think that's all the questions we have for today. I just want to thank you again one more time, Drew, for your excellent and informative presentation. Really interesting research and a very nice presentation. I also wanted to say,
flower photos.
What was that?
We put a lot of flower photos in there.
Yes, we do appreciate the flower photos here with the Native Plant Society. A big thanks, of course, to Denise and the Washington Native Plant Society for providing this platform for us to do all these presentations, especially during COVID. Thanks to Connie and the rest of our chapter, all of our chapter members that came tonight, and all of the non-Wenatchee Valley chapter Native Plant Society members that came. Also, I would like to thank my friend Maureen Duane, who over email introduced Drew and I and suggested that this would be potentially a match made in heaven in terms of an interesting talk and a good platform for it. So thank you so much, everyone. And Drew, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. It's been fun. Thank you.